with a brief introduction of myself and what I have been doing at APU. My name is Kripa. I teach physics at APU. I've been teaching electricity and magnetism, programming, thermal physics, and recently I taught a course in climate science, Introduction to Climate Science. I've also been teaching quantitative methods for biology students, etc. So my training is has been in Bangalore. I studied in Raman Research Institute. I did my PhD there. It is in an area called soft condensed matter physics, but better understood as biophysics. So my PhD was about the structure of cell membranes. I continue to do some amount of research in biology, in the interface of biology and physics at APU. But more and more I'm getting involved in more pedagogical problems in physics and working with project students in such areas. So that's it. This is a brief introduction to myself. So I wanted to share with all of you some of the ideas I had over the years and some things I have picked up from various textbooks, etc., about how to incorporate concepts and problems from biology and climate science in the physics classroom. So this is the broad topic. So let me just share my screen. Okay, so beforehand, I must apologize. Even in spite of the lockdown and online, I have not become very good at making slides. So this is really my best effort at making slides. I'll try to use some sort of mixture of Blackboard and videos and slides to go about this talk. So as you can see, the title of my talk is Examples. It's a very elaborate title, not at all elegant. Examples from biology and climate science in the physics classroom. Obviously, you can understand what it means very clearly. But the theme I'm focusing on is heat transfer. So just to give you my reasons for doing so and all, why am I talking about this in this workshop? I'm interested in bringing about these examples in the physics classroom so that students see a broader relevance of the things that they study. So often we are constantly talking about, pendula and springs and balls and sports, etc. These are the commonly used examples in the physics classroom. A lot of sports is used. And rightly so, because these are simple systems which can be idealized easily. You can remove friction, you can remove air resistance, etc. And you can make some claim about these systems. And also these systems, especially like if you're talking about cricket or football or something, these are macroscopic systems and students have daily experience with them. So just like that, biology also has a lot of daily experience attached to it, but it's not obvious how to use biology in the classroom. Similarly, these days, climate science is becoming more and more important, and it's important to be able to understand such a complicated science even at a school level. So how do we do so, and can we do so using physics? In the physics classroom itself, can we introduce some concepts in climate science, etc.? My second motivation is to blur the boundaries between disciplines. There has to be an S there. So, in school, it's nice that students have really physics, chemistry, biology, maths. They're studying all of these together. But once students come to college, these boundaries get established. And so every now and then it's important to blur these boundaries by seeing how interrelated these fields are. And finally, it's important to convey some relevant science in the process of teaching. We may be teaching idealized systems, but there are some important pieces of scientific information that all people should know, and especially at school or college, undergraduate institutions, these things must be taught. So covering this in some course or the other is important. And since we are all physics people, we'll do it in the classrooms that we have been allotted. Someone is, I don't know who it is, but let's see. Could you mute yourselves if you are not asking questions? Suman Rai Chaudhary, sorry to call you out. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Yeah, so I'll just move on. Okay, so before I get into the focus of this talk, I'll just talk about very broadly what are the kinds of examples one can use in mechanics and E&M. So in mechanics, for example, one could talk about flight of birds. What is the physics of running, walking, lifting weights? And of course, in climate science, we would be talking about tides, the tidal effect, and the Coriolis effect, etc. So these are some, just a short list of examples, just to give you some context. Similarly, in electricity and magnetism, the immediate biological system that this is relevant to is conduction of nerve impulses. Like how we think is a very interesting and important problem, and students are very interested in it. And so this would be a good opportunity to introduce some bio in a physics class, like talk about how nerve impulses actually are getting conducted, and in the process how we manage to control our motor functions, etc., using these nerve impulses. Similarly, in climate science, these are familiar examples that might already be discussed quite thoroughly in the physics classrooms. Atmospheric electricity, northern lights, lightning, etc. These are quite commonly used examples which already exist. So today's focus, there are so many examples, but I would be talking about mainly this theme, which is mechanisms of heat transfer. And all of us know that there is a stock answer to this. What are the mechanisms of heat transfer? Three marks question, 3 answers: conduction, convection, and radiation. So in this context specifically, let me list out the examples that I'm going to talk about. Under conduction, I will be talking about how the size of animals changes in relation to their habitat. So do you find larger animals in colder climates or warmer climates? Is there any reasoning or understanding behind the size of animals and where they choose to live? Under convection, I will be talking about ocean currents, and under radiation, I will be briefly mentioning the greenhouse effect. So at any point of time, please do stop me if you have any questions or comments or doubts that you need clarification for. You can just unmute yourself and stop me. I won't be monitoring the chat box very closely. Is that okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. All right, so let me just tell you what conduction is. I mean, obviously, all of you know already what conduction is, but my favorite way to sort of get the students to imagine conduction is by, I mean, there are many ways. During this online time, these PhET simulations became very, very popular, and and they became popular for a reason. They're actually very good visualizations of many, many phenomena. So what I like to do is show a simulation for diffusion, which is available on PhET Colorado. So I hope everybody knows about this. PhET simulations. These are now commonly used as visualizations and for many concepts. So let me just show you, sorry. Let me show you what I mean. So I hope you can see my screen. This is a simulation which I was already running. The website is, I'll send you a brief write-up of this talk. So I will include all these links in it. So what you have here is particles which are just exhibiting random motion via collision. And currently they are, these blue and red particles are separated by a barrier. Now on the left-hand side, you have 30 particles. And on the right-hand side also, you have 30 particles. They have the same mass and the same radius, but they have different initial temperature. So you can see how this initial temperature impacts their movement when you play the simulation. So what you notice is that the lower temperature gas molecules are moving at a very low velocity. And this is in agreement with this is basically based on the Maxwell-Boltzmann velocity distribution, or the kinetic theory of gases that you may have heard of. Right? So this is obviously colder and this is warmer because these molecules here are moving very slowly compared to this. And now what you do is you remove the divider. And what I would like you to notice is that first you will notice most of the red particles moving towards the blue one more than the opposite way around. And very slowly you'll notice that the blue particles also start moving faster. Okay, so I'll just remove the divider and you can pay attention to what is happening with these particles. So you do notice that some of these blue particles, initially they were moving very slowly, but because they've been collided with multiple times, etc., by the red particles, they have also acquired quite a large velocity, and there is some mean velocity, this mean temperature that is ultimately reached between these two sets of particles. So broadly, this is how conduction happens. Okay, so conduction happens via the random motion of particles. And yeah, I will share the links with all of you in a handout. You will also be given the video recording, so you don't have to be worried about that. You won't lose any information. So just to reiterate, conduction is happening via these random movements of particles. Like here in this liquid or gas, it's basically the diffusion of molecules from one side of the partition to the other side of the partition, right? And in a solid, you would have, for example, you would have, let's say, imagine a crystalline solid, which are, where these masses are sort of connected via springs. So in a crystalline solid also, you can have conduction, but they will be via local movement of these masses. So locally things are moving, and slowly this movement passes on to the neighbors, right? So conduction involves random movement, and there's an exchange of energy required between particles and their neighbors. So broadly, that's how one visualizes conduction. Conduction can take place in solids, liquid, and gases, and they happen via local vibrations of movements and exchange of energy, either via springs in a solid or via collisions in a gas or a liquid. Right? So there is a mathematical framework, and I won't go too much into detail, but just to give you a sense of how conduction is intimately related to diffusion, this framework is very important. So let's imagine that there is a quantity that we are interested in called heat flux. So how does one define this heat flux? You say that take a given window of time, right? Take a small window of time dt and find the amount of heat that is transferred across a distance L. That is the heat flux. So in this schematic, you can see that there is a hot region or reservoir or something like that. There's something hot and there is something cold. Okay. And there is some material connecting the hot and the cold regions. So one is asking the question, suppose I take a time interval dt, how much heat is actually going from the hot to the cold reservoir across this length? How much heat is flowing from here to here in a time dt? That is the quantity called the heat flux. Right? So if we were to write down a mathematical form for heat flux, this flux should be, first of all, proportional to the difference in temperature. So if the hot junction is much hotter than the cold junction, then the amount of heat that flows is much more. And so it should depend on the difference between the temperatures. Similarly, it should be inversely proportional to the length, because larger the length, more this has to travel. Right? So the amount of heat will per unit time would be smaller if the length was larger. And it is obviously directly proportional to the cross-sectional area. So here you imagine that this is actually maybe a rod or something, and it has a given cross-sectional area. And so this heat flux would be directly proportional to the cross-sectional area. And finally, all these quantities are put together, and one introduces a proportionality constant, which is kappa, and that is called the conductivity. Okay, so this is a very, very basic schematic to understand how one writes down an equation for heat flux. All right, and then to extend this, let's take a very specific case where we are looking only at heat conduction in 1D. So in one dimension, we start with some, let's imagine, for example, an iron rod, and we are keeping one end of the rod very hot and one end of the rod very cold. And then you ask the question, what is an equation which governs the temperature of the rod at some position x at any given time t? Okay, so this is the question that we ask. And so how does one understand the construction of the equation? You use the assertion that the change in the heat energy, or which is a proxy for the temperature, actually the temperature is proxy for heat energy. The change in the heat energy in this segment, take this segment and find out how much heat has come in and gone out, and that will tell you how much the heat energy of this segment has changed. Okay, so if you measure that amount of heat energy in a time dt, that would be equal to whatever has come in minus whatever has gone out, right? So essentially what we have is okay, so I'll have to start writing partial derivatives, but bear with me. Huh? You know, it's not easy to do this, but bear. So the change in the heat energy, okay, that would be equal to the influx of heat minus the efflux of heat. And from the previous slide, what we know is that the influx of heat is actually the temperature difference between the two ends of the segment divided by the length of the segment. So we can just put that back. So this is going to be equal to kappa A times delta T by delta X at X. Okay, so this is the amount which is coming in at X minus delta T by delta X at X plus delta. So those of you, some of you may have recognized that this is actually a difference in derivatives. So a difference in derivatives itself is actually a second derivative, right? So I won't bore you with the details, and one can find it in any textbook, but I will just write down the final equation that all of this mathematical jugglery results in. So if we put all these pieces of information together, you get an equation for the temperature of this rod at any position X at any time T. And that equation, it looks like this: del T, or maybe I should write it better, the partial derivative of temperature with respect to time at position X and T. This is equal to some conductivity times the partial derivative, actually the second derivative of the temperature with respect to space. Okay, this is the heat equation, which is actually identical to the diffusion equation. So you can see the connection between diffusion and the heat equation clearly in this equation. So anyway, so all of this is just the preamble. I thought there's a very nice example where all of this stuff starts to make sense in a very amazing way. And this is an example from biology. And you ask the question, this question is very simple. Sorry, the assertion is actually very simple. The assertion is that small animals cannot survive in very cold climates. So you can just take a minute and think about it, and from all the National Geographic videos you have seen over the years, you might suddenly notice that, as you go closer and closer to the poles, the animals start getting larger and larger. So you have walruses and seals and polar bears and all that, but hardly any, there are no rats that survive in the North Pole, and small animals would freeze to death in the North Pole. And also closer to the poles, so they don't have to go very far away from the equator, right? And you start seeing that, smaller animals start dropping off as you go higher and further away from the equator. So it's surprising, but there's a analysis that you can do which shows you why this is so. Okay, and so let's imagine that there is this small animal which is represented here by a sphere. It is a warm-blooded animal, so its temperature is TH, and it is kept at TH, or its temperature is basically TH, let's just say. Okay, and the outside temperature is TC, and this animal has a radius R. So a rough size estimate of the animal would be R. Now, how we work out that small animals cannot survive cold climates? That's a strange connection to make here. So the rationale that we use is that for an animal to survive properly, I mean, comfortably, without actually suffering, the heat production inside the animal due to metabolic activities should be at least the same as the heat lost to the environment. Okay, right? If the heat production inside the animal is less than the heat lost to the environment, then you reach a situation where it is too cold and you start to freeze. But warm-blooded animals can manage a little higher temperature because we have other mechanisms of cooling down, for example, sweating, etc. So if the heat produced is a little greater than the heat lost, then you're at a comfortable, you have a comfortable existence. Okay. So to work this out, you use the understanding that the rate of heat production should be proportional to the volume. Okay, so rate of heat production. This should be proportional to the volume, and the rate of heat loss we know that this is the interface, right, between the system and the surrounding. So the rate of heat loss, as we saw in the previous equations, should actually be proportional to the surface area. So this should be proportional to the surface area. Okay. So, and this Rp should be just a little greater than Rl, and then this animal would live happily. Okay. So let's just convert all these proportionalities into some equalities using a few constants. So since we have a sphere, we have basically K1, Rp is K1 R cube because it's proportional to volume. And this has to be greater than another constant K2 times R square because the rate of heat loss is proportional to. And what this tells you is that there is a minimum size. R has to be greater than or equal to K2 by K1. If R is less than K2 by K1, then the animal will freeze to death. So that explains why, I have cats at home and they always feel much more cold than I do, because in spite of the fact that they have fur, because they are much smaller. And so their surface area compared to the volume is actually higher than our surface area compared to volume. So this is one aspect of it. And one can extend this just a little bit. And you can ask, okay, maybe maybe small animals cannot survive, but what if I give them a really thick coat? Is it then possible that they can survive? That's another question you can ask. So let's then look at the question of what is the thickness of the coat required in order for this small animal to survive. Okay. So how do you analyze this? Now here, you have to bring in the conductivity of the coat. How does the coat conduct? Right? So the rate of the amount of heat in a given time dt, the amount of heat that is lost to the environment, we know that we wrote down a formula for that. We said that is equal to kappa A by L Th minus Tc. That is what we wrote down in the very beginning. Here you would have to replace A with 4 with the area of a sphere, which is sort of centered in between, somewhere within the coat, right? And L would be replaced by delta R, which is the size of that coat. So let's just write down what it is. The heat that is lost in a given amount of time across the coat is equal to kappa times 4 pi R plus delta R by 2 whole square divided by delta R times delta T. Delta T is just TH minus TC. Okay. And I can do some, again, mathematical jugglery. Okay. And I can write this down as this is 4 pi times R plus delta R times delta T divided by delta R by R. Okay, so this is what it actually is. Now, this is the rate of heat loss. We've actually used conductivity, etc., and we have arrived at some formula for heat loss. Now, that should be equal to the amount of heat produced. And we said earlier that that is some constant times the volume, right? So it's actually 4 pi times something r cube. Essentially, it's some constant times r cube. So this is the rate of heat production, and this is the rate of heat loss. And this rate of heat production has to be greater than equal to rate of heat loss in order for this animal to survive. Okay, so well, you can just solve this equation. I don't want to do a lot of algebra here, but essentially we need to pick out an equation which relates delta R to delta T. Okay, and what we get is, suppose we equate these two, what we get is that delta R is equal to, let me just look at my notes. One cannot mug up these equations and things like that. So just look at my note. This is equal to 4 pi k kappa delta T divided by C times R minus 4 pi kappa delta T. Okay. Now you must be wondering, oh my God, what are all these formula? But this formula, final formula, is very interesting. So we should just stare at it and ponder about it a little bit. So let me just tell you about this final formula. On the left hand side, what you have is the thickness of the coat. And on the right hand side, you have the difference between the outside and inside temperature and the radius. Okay. So what you notice is that if the radius is if the radius is larger and larger, the thickness of the coat becomes smaller and smaller. And that makes sense because the larger animals have a better capacity to retain heat, right? They produce more heat than they lose. But if this radius reaches some critical value, if the denominator becomes 0, then the thickness of the coat will become infinite, which means that at some finite, not 0, greater than 0 value of R, this left hand side is going to blow up. Okay, and so that tells you that in spite of having a thick coat, some animals will just not be able to survive. So this is an interesting just scaling kind of argument using the ideas of conductivity to show something which is quite surprising in biology. So I'll just stop. Are there any questions right now about this? please, if you have any questions, just please go ahead, because I won't be able to see what's happening. Go ahead, Vaibhav.
Yeah, I
Yes.
wanted to ask, in that case, for a rat, what would be a typical size rat can survive, let's say, Antarctica?
Okay. So when it comes to what is a typical rat size, so they will not be able to survive. That is the question. That is the answer to it. But let's say you are given, okay, so imagine you have to calculate the size of a animal which can survive in Antarctica. Okay. So then you would have to put in some real numbers there. So what is the minimum size that can survive? This denominator has to be greater than 0 in order for the animal to survive. So CR has to be greater than 4 pi kappa delta T. So the specifics of the problem all depend on what is the numerical value of this constant, what is the numerical value of this constant, etc. So this constant, actually, I have a reasonable idea of. There is a law in biology called Kleiber's law, which relates the metabolic rate to the mass of the animal. So this constant is kind of known, and its value is 3.6 in some units. But conductivity, I do not actually know what the value is. So, but it might be well known, fur and things like that. Those materials might have a well-known conductivity. I would guess that it's like, actually, I don't have any guesses. I don't know what the value would be. But yeah, it's a good question. Any other questions? All right. Okay. So yeah, but it's really interesting to ask students. When I've told this in class, I always ask them, think of all the cold habitat animals. What do you come up with? Mostly they come up with marine animals. The ones, the fish, etc., which are reasonably small, all the living creatures which are reasonably small live in the ocean, because the ocean, at least in the closer to the poles, is set by, it's sort of a thermostat set by the ice. So they can survive, but below freezing, which is what is the condition above the ocean, you hardly have any small creatures. Most of them are below, in the ocean, and not on the land. And students are always very excited to think about this. It's a very strange fact. All right, so this was my example for conduction. And for convection, I was going to talk about this, but we don't have too much time, so I'll go on. For convection, I have a very fascinating set of examples from climate science. So the difference really between conduction and convection is that convection involves flows or movements of molecules from one location to another. And even diffusion is like that, but really diffusion is via local energy exchange. In convection, you do not need any local energy exchange for heat to be exchanged across great distances, because particles themselves are moving. So, sorry. So to illustrate this, we will look at the example of ocean currents. So here's a sketch of the vertical structure of the ocean at the equator. Okay, so let's imagine this is the ocean, and I'm just looking at how the temperature changes as you go further and further down in the ocean. So at the equator, what is happening is, the sun's radiation is really quite strong at the equator. So a lot of heating is happening at the surface. So as a result, what happens is warm water is present at the surface of the ocean, and cold water is present at the bottom. Now, all of us know that warm water tends to, warm things are less dense, and hence they would stay aloft compared to more dense things. So warm water would remain here. There is no possibility for warm water for any water here to actually mix with the water down further down, because it is warm, right? And this is actually something which would spell death for the ocean life. And that's because imagine that, there are fish in the ocean, and they're eating and all of that. And, the metabolic waste goes and finally settles at the bottom, right? So all of this is fodder for new life to come about. All the waste of uh, biological organisms, all organisms are biological. All the waste is basically going to end up becoming the nutrition for plants to take up, right? So that's how the whole cycle of life works. But if there is no circulation in the ocean, there's no possibility of mixing of the ocean waters. And so all of the nutritious material and all the fodder for new growth remains at the bottom. Okay. So if this was the condition, there is heat at the top, there's warm water at the top, there's cold water at the top, and everything is just stagnant, and there is no movement from top to bottom because of this temperature structure, that's the end of ocean life. Okay. So this is obviously not actually what happens, because we know that in equatorial waters, ocean life, there is a lot of ocean life. We know that fish thrive in equatorial waters. We also know that there is a lot of phytoplankton in ocean waters, right? So what is the mechanism for mixing then? If this is the temperature profile of the ocean, there is no possibility of mixing. So then how does one actually get the ocean waters to mix? So that is a very important question. So the answer to this, okay, so let's just put a pin in that, and we'll also consider just briefly what is the structure of the vertical structure or temperature profile of the ocean closer to the poles. Okay, so just briefly we'll consider what's happening there as well. So at the poles you have cold water on top. I mean, there's a lot of the air above the water is cold, right? It's not at the poles. So we're looking at, like, say 10 degrees centigrade or something like that over here. Okay, so it's a little less extreme than the equator. So here also the water is a little less cold than in the top region, about 100 meters or so. The water is a little less cold than the water over here. So here also there's a problem of lack of mixing. Closer to the poles also, although the temperature structure, the gradient is not so sharp, there is still a small gradient which does not enable mixing of waters. Okay. So how is it that we actually have marine life in such regions? There are two ways to beat this lack of mixing. One phenomenon is called upwelling, okay, and that is created by evacuating the surface water with wind. So I'll show you a video where that is happening. And another phenomenon is called thermohaline circulation, wherein the surface water actually evaporates, making the surface water more dense, and finally that dense surface water sinks and enables convection currents to get set up. And so you have again mixing. Okay. Another possibility is if the surface water is actually cool because the outside air is cool, then also it will sink. And when something from the top sinks, it means that something from the bottom goes up, and there's this actual flow of material that happens. So I'll just show you a couple of videos where and some experiments that our students have done, where both of these effects are noticeable. Just a second. Okay, I hope you can see this. So what is happening is this blue ink at the bottom, there's a fan blowing on top. Okay, and because of that, there is the wind evacuates some of the warm water. It moves away some of the warm water from some points and thereby enables the bottom cold water to rise up. Okay, so you can see that this is very different from conduction or diffusion, because this actually involves a flow of material from the bottom to the top. It's a convective current that's forming, and it's not just random diffusion. So here is the fan. It's just blowing some air so that, it's just blowing on the surface so that you can induce some winds. And because of that, you can even do it with just some plate, and you can sort of, it's not very noticeable, but here in this video, it is quite noticeable. You see that there's this movement of bottom cold water to the top warm water because of wind. Okay. And this is a phenomenon called upwelling. And upwelling is something that happens on the Earth's surface due to the trade winds. So trade winds are actually winds which are close to the equator. And because of the trade winds are blowing from the east to the west. And because of that, they're actually blowing this hot surface water from the east to the west. And as they're blowing it away, the cold, deep water from the depths of the ocean come up in some sort of convective flow. So you're enabling the exchange of temperature via this process of upwelling. I would also like to show you an experiment where you make use of the difference in density of water, and that creates a convective effect. So let me just show you. Unfortunately, I do not have a video for this, but some of our students did some very simple experiments, and they have some photographs. So this is broadly the experimental setup. You have a fish tank and you make a barrier within the fish tank. On one side, you sort of simulate the poles by adding either salt or ice cubes to make it cold. And on the other side, you have warm water, and then the barrier is lifted, and then you ask what happens, where does the final thing end? And so what you see is that this blue water is actually cold water, and they grabbed a photograph after everything happened. Initially, it was all blue here and all red here, but when the barrier was lifted, you can see that the cold water goes and settles at the bottom. Yeah, and all the hot warm water is gone here. And this is something that's not a preferred state of affairs, because you want there to be mixing in the ocean. But this shows you very clearly that there is a separation. There's actually very clear separation or gradient of temperature as you go deeper and deeper into the ocean. Similarly, there's another one where they looked at salinity. So the more saline water, which was again blue, both of them are at the same temperature here, but the more saline water actually sank to the bottom. Okay. And yeah, this is basically what happens when both of them are the same temperature. They are slowly just mixing laterally without going underneath. So you do not get any vertical structure if they're all at the same temperature. So this is also quite an amazing thing, because if you just use the ideas of conduction, it basically means that all life is going to die. But if you have convective currents in the ocean, then that is the reason for the thriving of marine life in these regions. And I'll just show you a picture which shows you exactly this. And this is actually a satellite picture of chlorophyll, phytoplankton distribution. And you can see that along the equator and along these Arctic and Antarctic circles, there seem to be a lot of phytoplankton, a lot of plant activity, right? And this is because, first of all, these phytoplankton survive only on the ocean surface. They survive on the ocean surface because they need light. Chlorophyll requires light to produce food, but they will not survive on the ocean surface if nutrients do not cycle from the bottom of the ocean to the top. So the trade winds which blow from the trade winds essentially go in from the east to west direction. They go like this, and because of that, the cold water from the bottom comes up, provides nutrients for the phytoplankton to thrive. The phytoplankton, again, they are doing their metabolism, photosynthesis, etc. And finally, all of this goes down. There's some ocean cycle, which vertical sort of Hadley cell, which is created. This is, I really like this example because you can show it like a physics thing in the lab. You know, you have dyes and everything, and they are just moving because salinity, temperature, wind, etc. are changing the way they behave. But you can also see the effect that it has, such a drastic and stark effect that it has on marine life. And you can see that very clearly in the satellite image of phytoplankton. So I think I should stop here because I had one more topic and we do not have time for that. But I'll stop here and I'll take questions. Any questions, any points of discussion that you would like to discuss further? Anything that you would like me to provide, for example, if you're interested in using these things in the classroom?
Yeah, ma'am, good morning.
Hi.
Hi. Ma'am, can we prepare this this box in which you are putting the liquid, cold and hot?
Yeah. So it is actually just a lab. We only made that fish tank. It's just pieces of glass which are glued together with some silicone gel, silicone glue. That's all it is. There's nothing else. When we did the experiment, the barrier was not very well made. So I will have to work on that a little bit. But otherwise, it's very simple to make with very easily available materials. If you're, I will send you a handout where the basic design is explained in some detail.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, one more thing, like to make us sea water. So, how much salt we need to add, or is there any other way?
Actually, we just we did not add that much salt. In perhaps we added about 1 teaspoon of salt in a glass in one glass. That's all. That's all was needed for the salt water to sink to the bottom. You don't need much difference.
Okay. Like it was a nice experience for me to see lots of things which can be introduced in my class during teaching the heat chapter, because this is very like monotonous kind of chapter. But now I think I can do the justice with that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good morning, ma'am. Hello.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, ma'am. Ma'am, I have seen that if you put a shark in a fish tank, it doesn't grow to its original size. Does this has? I mean, this can also be explained with the same concept.
it does not grow to its.
Yeah, because we were talking about habitat, how the size is influenced by the habitat, right?
Yeah.
So if you put a shark in a fish tank, its size is restricted. It doesn't grow very huge.
Is that right? Okay.
So what is the relation of physics over here?
I don't know. I think there might be some complicated physics at play here, because there are stresses, right? Even bonsai and things like that are essentially something like that. Basically, you are stressing the plant in such a way so that the size is restricted, and
Yeah, well,
so it's not a simple physics, is all I'm saying.
yeah,
My example was more it was a macroscopic sort of understanding without.
yeah, got it. And there are other examples as well. I think from biology. I think when we explain the chapter of elasticity, we can take the example of anglerfish, which can survive more than 100 times the pressure that we are experiencing right now. I think these fishes are found in deep Mariana Trench, right? Anglerfish. So, what has elasticity and Young's modulus got to do with this? There are other examples. I think like honeybees can detect the path in which direction they have to fly by using the concept of polarization of light, because their eyes have an inbuilt polarized filter.
Yes.
So there are other fields of physics also apart from thermal, I think, which can be incorporated in the teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. Even about habitat, the kinds of eyes that fish have depends on the depth at which they live. That also is an interesting optics example. And of course, you have insects with extremely complex eyes. You have structural color imparted by wings of butterflies. So there are many, obviously, many examples.
It was a very wonderful session, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thanks.